of a sort of larger project that we initially called What Does the New China Think, where we both with European Council members went to China and had discussions, engaged with a lot of Chinese intellectuals, and then made this book. And as part of this book project is going around Europe, because Europe, as we know, is just not only the EU of the European institutions in Brussels, but made up of 27 member states and 21 different languages. So we're taking part in the different national debates about what China sort of means for Europe is an important part of this project, which brings us here to Madrid today. If we look at sort of European priorities in nearly everything, China is now looming as a bigger and bigger issue and partner. So when we talk about climate change, something that's dear to Europeans, we all saw in 2009 in Copenhagen that a deal at least isn't possible without the active involvement of China. Same in a lot of other areas. In the economy, China and Europe are tightly linked. It's been in the last decade primarily European investments in China and sort of export goods from China flowing to Europe. What we're seeing now is a beginning of a reversal of that, with more Chinese investments also flowing to Europe, creating then a new sort of financial umbilical cord between China and Europe. So this is why China matters to Europe. It also matters as sort of foreign policy test of the sort of the new European Union. With the Lisbon Treaty, which seemed to have receded slightly into the background because we're also taken by the euro crisis and our economic problems in Europe, was actually the idea that Europe should play a global role, and now was the time that we had been internally had built peace inside the European Union, and now the time has come for the project of projecting a sort of more global voice of the European Union. And there, the sort of collaboration and with China is a sort of vital point for Europe for having this sort of more global voice. So I think that's some of the setting. The second point that we really wanted to make with this was to show how China debates, how beyond five-year plan, beyond the sort of slightly political theater you've seen now with the party congress and more set speeches, there is a vivid debate inside China about where the country is heading. And just as Deng Xiaoping, as we have as one of the co-chairs, saying, well, do not debate. This is one of my inventions. This perhaps worked for some time, but now there is a sort of growing debate about where China wants to go and in what direction and what model it should follow. So this is what, with the help of our three Chinese colleagues, will try to sort of give some of the explanation of where is China heading. To give one of the examples that I put in my chapter, I wrote the chapter together with my colleague François Goudemont about what does this all sort of mean for Europe, which is also something which would be great to sort of bring more into the debate. An example there was you have one of the Chinese prominent economists saying, well, China is almost 200, 300 years away from a market economy. This is Jiang Weijing, a very sort of liberal economist who thinks this has been a lost decade and China should have moved way further ahead with reforms, too many state-owned enterprises that should be privatized, and then this is his way. And you have another example of, in a complete different way, Justin Lin, who is also the chief economist of the World Bank, saying China will be able to still go on catching up and can do 20, 30 years of same type of high growth. I think this shows some of the sort of the diversity of the point of view we have. So basically with this one, this new little red book, which red books of course have a special significance in China, we wanted of course both to be quoted in the same way as the original book, but in a different way to show not uniformity of thought, but actually diversity of thinking, which is why there are 15 Chinese contributions in this, and the main point is basically of having China debate. Then one last point just about the title, why it's called China 3.0, which is Mark Leonard, our director and colleague, who's developed that in the introductory chapter. And so what his argument here is to say that China sort of moves in 30-year phases. I know one of my colleagues here will say, well, you're not taking the really long perspective on Chinese history and you should look way longer, but we can discuss that later. But the first 30-year period, the China 1.0, would be the China of Mao after the revolution, safeguarding the revolution. And then the second period, the China 2.0, being the Deng Xiaoping era, being the market economic reforms, being a China that in foreign policy was integrating with the world, but also trying to sort of lie low and not really be sort of noticed in international affairs. And what we're moving into now is like a new period of the China 3.0 in the next decade, where there's much more sort of debate, and where the successes of the last period now also lead to sort of difficulties in the next one. So if we take like the three successes of the last period, there's been, of course, the enormous growth of China, which is a story that most people know. That has led to a China that's much richer today, much more affluent, but is also now spawning its own problem, because ordinary Chinese are asking themselves about social inequality when that has been spiraling, saying, okay, everybody from the outside looks at China and they see a success. But a lot of ordinary Chinese says, but how has this success been distributed internally? How has riches been distributed internally when a lot is either going into state-owned enterprises or into sort of big infrastructure projects, and not necessarily always things that benefit directly ordinary citizens? So that is one debate of how the success of growing rich has also spawned problems. It also spawned problems of corruption, of environmental degradation. The same comes with stability. China has kept stability. The sort of the Middle Kingdom remains sort of united, which is an achievement on its own. But this focus on stability also comes with an increasing price, that you see growing social protest, and you see that the way of doing stability, sometimes, as one of the authors also put it in this. In our book, so it says every time extra effort and measures are put into stability preservation, well, it also creates new social tensions. So there's come to a level, and I think in numbers this can be exemplified very clearly with that China now spends more money on internal security than on military. So it shows also the sort of cost of maintaining stability. So there again, you see that the success is also sort of has its own sort of difficulty inherent in it. Last but not least is the question of power. The fact that China now is the world's second largest economy, has grown its militarily within the last 2 decades with double-digit growth, and is now a completely different player, both globally, with entrants ranging from the Arctic in the north to all around economically around the globe, and with a much stronger say also in its neighborhood. So this, of course, makes it very, very difficult to continue the type of policy where China is just sort of lying low and saying we take care of our own internal development, and the world is going on outside on its own. So again, here you have new dilemmas here for the China 3.0. To discuss these issues with me, we have an eminent group of Chinese thinkers with me. So first of all, I'll start this time over here with Cui Jiyuan, who is from Tsinghua University, who sparked fame in China and beyond on quite early in his career with an article about the sort of second liberation of thought, and has been one that's been sort of arguing in a Chinese climate where, in his view, it moves sort of too quickly from Mao to sort of a complete espousal of neoliberal ideas of questions of social equality, of what type of development model for China, and therefore it's been associated inside China with what's called the sort of the new left that has a focus on that, and has also been one of the researchers that has been going beyond the sort of news headlines on the Chongqing model that you've heard of, on which I guess mostly in the West is known for now for the political scandal surrounding Bo Xilai and his political push for power and subsequent fall from power. But what Jiyuan, I think, will explain us more about is also how Chongqing is part of this whole social laboratory on what model is going to be the new China, on mixing rural and urban, of creating domestic consumption, creating the right grounds for domestic consumption, making the right mix between public and private. So all of this he will share with us in a minute. And I then have here next to me Pan Wei with Beijing University, who's a prolific writer and thinker. Very broadly, we've had already on this trip great discussion ranging from caudillos in Latin America. And what I will highlight specifically now has been your work on the China model, where you've particularly been emphasizing, well, there is a possible different path from the Chinese. Some of this for China, some of this consists in meritocracy, which is the big invention, civil service, the big invention of the Chinese. It's not like most of us would think, paper or gunpowder, but this sort of long-term tradition of civil service and meritocracy. And also been arguing that, which goes against a lot of the sort of maybe Western thinking about China, that China can live fine without multi-party elections and has a system that needs change, but it's not the type of change that many Westerners would see as sort of pluralism and political elections as the future. Last but not at least, I have Xi Jinping, who is one of China's foremost sort of geostrategic thinkers, so that takes us to sort of China's foreign policy role. He's been also an advisor to the Chinese government on several of these issues, and is what I would classify as a good, solid realist, and was, for example, in Berlin telling a lot of Germans that instead of the sort of much more modern modern picture of Europe and Germany projected abroad, a classical figure like Bismarck is actually what is admired in China as somebody who stood up for national interest and a sort of sense of how to drive foreign policy forward, which of course doesn't always link that well with sort of Germany's view of its modern role, but which created a great and interesting discussion of some of these things, and which will here be able to sort of shed light on also the questions that Luis mentioned during his intervention on asking, is there going to be almost like a Monroe doctrine of China's in Asia, with China taking on a sort of predominant role in Asia? And the other question that Luis mentioned, highlighting the Libya evacuation with an astonishing amount of Chinese citizens rescued in a short time. How will this gradually influence Chinese foreign policy to sort of go abroad and have global economic interest and citizens abroad to protect? I will then now give you the word. I'll sway Dia, and I'll start with you this time around.